Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Momentum is building for a war between Ukraine and Russia.
Tensions between Russia and the West are growing rapidly.
President Biden considering deploying thousands of troops to Eastern Europe.
There are now 100,000 troops on the eastern border of Ukraine. Russia is setting up field hospitals on this border. Like, this is what preparation for war looks like, a legitimate war.
Ukrainian troops are watching and waiting, saying they are preparing for a fight.
The U.S. has ordered the families of embassy staff to leave Ukraine. Britain has sent all of their non-essential staff home. And now the U.S. is sending tons of weapons and munitions to Ukraine's army. And we're even considering deploying our own troops to the region. I mean, this thing is heating up. Meanwhile, Russia and the West have been in Geneva and Brussels trying to talk it out and sort of getting nowhere.
The message is very clear. Should Russia take further aggressive actions against Ukraine, the costs will be severe and the consequences serious.
It's a scary, grim momentum that is unpredictable. And the chances of miscalculation and escalation are growing. I want to explain what's going on here, but I want to show you that this isn't just typical geopolitical behavior, stuff that can just be explained on the map. Instead, to understand why 100,000 troops are camped out on Ukraine's eastern border, ready for war, you have to understand Russia and how it's been cut down over the ages, from a Slavic empire that dominated this whole region, to then the Soviet Union, which was defeated in the 90s. And what you really have to understand here is how that history is transposed onto the brain of one man, this guy, Vladimir Putin. This is a story about regional domination and struggles between big powers, but really, it's the story about what Vladimir Putin really wants.
Russian troops moving swiftly to take control of military bases in Crimea.
Russia is amassing more than 100,000 troops and a lot of military hardware at the border with Ukraine.
And I'm just gonna quickly give you the highlight version of like the news that's happening, because I wanna get into the juicy part, which is like why, the roots of all of this. So let's go. A few months ago, Russia started sending more and more troops to this border. It's this massive border between Ukraine and Russia. They said they were doing a military exercise, but the rest of the world was like, yeah, we totally believe you, Russia. This was right before this big meeting where North American and European countries were coming together to talk about a lot of different things, like these countries often do in these diplomatic summits. But soon, because of Russia's aggressive behavior coming in and setting up 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, the entire summit turned into a whole WTF Russia, what are you doing on the border of Ukraine meeting. Before the meeting, Putin comes out and says, listen, I have some demands for the West. And everyone's like, okay, Russia, what are your demands? You know, we have like COVID-19 right now and like that's like surging. So like, we don't need your like bluster about what your demands are. And Putin's like, no, here's my list of demands. Putin's demands for the summit were this. Number one, that NATO, which is this big military alliance between US, Canada, and Europe, stop expanding, meaning they don't let any new members in, okay? So Russia's like, no more new members to your like cool military club that I don't like. You can't have any more members. Number two, that NATO withdraw all of their troops from anywhere in Eastern Europe. Basically, Putin is saying, I can veto any military cooperation or troops going between countries that have to do with Eastern Europe, the place that used to be the Soviet Union, okay? And number three, Putin demands that America vow not to protect its allies in Eastern Europe with nuclear weapons. LOL, said all of the other countries. You're literally nuts, Vladimir Putin. Like, these are the most ridiculous demands ever. But there he is, Putin, with these demands, these very, very aggressive demands. And he sort of is implying that if his demands aren't met, he's going to invade Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't work like this. This is not how international relations work. You don't just show up and say, like, I'm not going to allow other countries to join your alliance because it makes me feel uncomfortable. But what I love about this list of demands from Vladimir Putin for this summit is that it gives us a clue on what Vladimir Putin really wants, what he's after here. You read them closely and you can grasp his intentions. But to grasp those intentions, you have to understand what NATO is and what Russia and Ukraine used to be. Okay, so a while back I made this video about why Russia is so damn big, where I explain how modern day Russia started here in Kiev, which is actually modern day Ukraine. In other words, modern day Russia, as we know it, has its original roots in Ukraine. These places grew up together, and they eventually became a part of the same mega empire called the Soviet Union. They were deeply intertwined, not just in their history and their culture, but also in their economy and their politics. So it's after World War II, it's like the 50s, 60s, 70s, and NATO was formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a military alliance between all of these countries that was meant to sort of deter the Soviet Union from expanding and taking over the world. But, as we all know, the Soviet Union, which was Russia and all of these other countries, collapsed in 1991. And all of these Soviet republics, including Ukraine, became independent, meaning they were not now a part of one big block of countries anymore. But just because the borders all split up, it doesn't mean that these cultural ties actually broke. Like, for example, the Soviet leader at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this guy, Gorbachev, he was the son of a Ukrainian mother and a Russian father. Like, he grew up with his mother singing him Ukrainian folk songs. In his mind, Ukraine and Russia were like one thing. So there was major reluctance to accept Ukraine as a separate thing from Russia. In so many ways, they are one. There was another Russian at the time who did not accept this new division. This young intelligence officer, Vladimir Putin, who was starting to rise up in the ranks of post-Soviet Russia. There's this amazing quote from 2005 where Putin is giving the State of the Union address, where Putin declares the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And as for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. Do you see how he frames this? The Soviet Union were all one people in his mind. And after it collapsed, all of these people who were a part of the motherland were now outside of the fringes or the boundaries of Russian territory. First off, fact check. Greatest catastrophe of the 20th century? Like, do you remember what else happened in the 20th century, Vladimir? Putin's worry about the collapse of this one people starts to get way worse when the West, his enemy, starts showing up to his neighborhood, to all these ex-Soviet countries that are now independent. The West starts selling their ideology of democracy and capitalism and inviting them to join their military alliance called NATO. And guess what? These countries are totally buying it. All these ex-Soviet countries are now joining NATO, and some of them the EU, and Putin is hating this. He's like, not only did the Soviet Union divide and all of these people are now outside of the Russia motherland, but now they're being persuaded by the West to join their military alliance. This is terrible news. Over the years, this continues to happen while Putin himself starts to chip away at Russian institutions, making them weaker and weaker. He's silencing his rivals, and he's consolidating power in himself. And in the past few years, he's effectively silenced anyone who can challenge him. Any institution, any court, or any political rival have all been silenced. It's been decades since the Soviet Union fell, but as Putin gains more power, he still sees the region through the lens of the old Cold War, Soviet, Slavic Empire view. He sees this region as one big block that has been torn apart by outside forces. The greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And the worst situation of all of these, according to Putin, is Ukraine, which was like the gem of the Soviet Union. There was tons of cultural heritage. Again, Russia sort of started in Ukraine. Not to mention, it was a very populous and industrious, resource-rich place. And over the years, Ukraine has been drifting west. It hasn't joined NATO yet, but more and more it's been electing pro-Western presidents. It's been flirting with membership in NATO. It's becoming less and less attached to the Russian heritage that Putin so adores. And more than half of Ukrainians say that they'd be down to join the EU. 64% of them say that they would be cool joining NATO. But Putin can't handle this. He is in total denial. Like an ex-boyfriend who can't handle his ex-girlfriend starting to date someone else, Putin can't let Ukraine go. He won't let go. So for the past decade, he's been trying to keep the West out and bring Ukraine back into the motherland of Russia. This usually takes the form of Putin sending secret soldiers from Russia into Ukraine to help the people in Ukraine who want to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. It also takes the form of, stealing entire parts of Ukraine for Russia.
Russian troops moving swiftly to take control of military bases in Crimea.
Like in 2014, Putin just did this.
To what America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
He went down and just snatched this bit of Ukraine and folded it into Russia. So you're starting to see what's going on here. Putin's life's work is to salvage what he calls the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the division and the separation of the Soviet republics from Russia. So let's get to present day. It's 2022. Putin is at it again. And honestly, if you really want to understand the mind of Vladimir Putin and his whole view on this, you have to read this. On the History of Unity of Russians and Ukrainians by Vladimir Putin, a blog post that kind of sounds like a 9th grade history essay. In this essay, Vladimir Putin argues that Russia and Ukraine are one people. He calls them essentially the same historical and spiritual space. Kind of beautiful writing, honestly. Anyway, he argues that the division between the two countries is due to, quote, a deliberate effort by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. And that the formula they use, these outside forces, is a classic one: divide and rule. And then he launches into this super in-depth, 10-page argument as to every single historical beat of Ukraine and Russia's history to make this argument that this is one people and the division is totally because of outside powers, i.e. the West.